there gamers and geeks, I am Hypersyntax and welcome to my brief YouTube series that I am affectionately calling How to Gamer. This series is intended for those who are either looking to get into the hobby of gaming or those who have taken the plunge but are feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of modern games. Don't worry, we'll take it slow in this first video titled Introduction to Basic Gaming Concepts. As mentioned, this will be a brief YouTube series, so there'll be a few videos for your reference. In this video, we're going to take a quick overlook of what you'll find in modern gaming. We'll start off with the character sheet, just some basic information of what you find there, what the information holds, and what it all means. Then we'll take a very quick look at the different character classes, and we'll get into more detail of those in later videos. And we'll wrap this video up with some key concepts and terms that are common throughout all gaming. Once you have the basics covered, then we're going to take a closer look at each one of the classes with its own video, starting with the fighters, moving on to the rogues, and ending with the mages. Now, as I mentioned before, in this video we will have a very brief overview of these classes, but that's just to get you familiar with the terms and what their purposes are. Following this, we'll have one video dedicated for each type of class and their role in modern gaming. Once you have a grasp of the concepts and terms, all the information, and you've gone through the purpose of each particular class, then we'll move on and complete this course with some adventuring basics. Basically, what you can expect to run into in your open world and types of scenarios that you'll commonly find yourself in. To start things off, we'll take a quick look at the most basic of basics as far as gaming is concerned, the character sheet. Now, your character sheet is essentially a window into your digital soul. It will give you all the information for your character or other characters that you may be traveling with. The first thing you may notice is your profile pic. On this sheet of Shira-chan, we have both a headshot and a full body shot. This will let you know what your character looks like, both up close so you can see all the facial features, and what gear they're wearing. The next thing you'll notice is there are a whole lot of numbers scattered throughout this sheet. The top half of these numbers are known as your health stats. Those will be your hit points, magic points, and your various attribute stats. We'll get into those in the next few slides. The bottom half of this character sheet, that all deals with combat. Your armor rating, your attack rating, and your various elemental resistances. Again, all of this will be covered one by one later in this video. To start this off, we'll take a look at the most widely used term in gaming, hit points. Hit points is what we use to describe how much health a person has. So basically, you'll get into combat at some point, and you'll do damage to an enemy, and you'll reduce their hit points by a given amount. They'll do damage to you, and your hit points will be reduced by a given amount. If your hit points ever reach 0, you're dead. So keep an eye on that throughout the entire game. Magic points is the measure of magical energy that your character can use. Now this can also be called mana or spirit energy or some other type of ethereal sounding term based on what game you're playing, but it's all essentially the same thing. If you need to cast a spell, you're going to use some of your magical energy. The amount of magic points that you have is the amount of energy that you can use to cast the spell. If the spell requires more magic than you currently have, then you're unable to cast a spell. So in that way, it kind of works like hit points, but you don't die when you lose all of your magic points. You just can't cast any more spells. Experience points, or XP, is what you gain when you do stuff. For example, when you defeat an enemy, you get a few experience points. If you complete a quest, you gain some experience points. If you complete some type of beneficial action, you gain experience points. Basically, if you do stuff, you gain experience. Eventually, when you do enough stuff, you'll gain a level. A level is a numeric term in which you can gauge how powerful your character is. Every time you gain a level, your character will become incrementally stronger. So if you kill enough enemies or you do enough beneficial things, you'll gain a level, and in turn you'll gain more hit points, you'll gain more magic points, and you may even increase your stats and abilities. So get out there, do a lot of stuff, get really strong so you can do even more stuff. Yes, that's basically the cycle of how gaming works. Moving on to character stats, these are the numbers moving down the left-hand side of the character sheet. Starting off with strength, this is the most basic one, it should be easy to understand. It's how strong your character is. There's really nothing complex here, it's literally how strong they are. The stronger they are, the more damage that they can do, typically with physical attacks, and the more gear that they can carry. Next on the list is dexterity, also known as agility. This is how quickly they can move and how nimble they are. Typically, characters who rely on their speed and agility will want to have a high dexterity. Rather than taking on enemies head-on and using their strength, they're going to use their dexterity to either move around and flank them, or use their agility to make sure that they land precision shots. So once again, this is how quickly they move and how agile they are. It could be either dexterity or agility. The two terms are pretty much interchangeable. The next slots, intelligence and wisdom, could be interchangeable, but it mainly depends on which game you're playing and how they handle this stat. In either way, it's a measure of your character's mental acuity. So yes, how smart they are, how they are able to interpret information. This will be more for your science types or your mages that need to interpret arcane symbols and lore or things of that nature. Charisma is a measure of how much people like you. Now, benefits of having a high charisma could be getting better deals when you're trying to trade goods, either sell or buy things at a shop, or if you're trying to influence people to have them do what you want them to do, strike a deal, perhaps even talk your way out of a situation. Things of that nature are all dependent upon how high your charisma score is. Constitution and endurance are how healthy or how hardy your character is. As opposed to strength, which is just strictly how strong you are, Constitution and endurance works a little bit differently. If you have a high constitution or endurance, typically you'll have a higher amount of hit points, you'll have a higher amount of stamina, whether or not your game actually accounts for that, and you'll be able to go longer distances without rest. So it's not necessarily how strong you are, it's how much you can endure, thus the name. And finally, we have luck. Now, luck is a little bit more hard to define. It will affect pretty much everything that you do. It will act as a final coefficient, per se, of all of your actions, such as scoring critical hits, which we'll talk about later, or any other action where there's some type of random chance of something happening. Your final luck score may influence things in your favor depending on how strong your luck is. Moving on to combat, if you see a sword or gun icon somewhere on your screen, that will usually indicate your attack power. And your attack is how much damage you inflict per each strike. So obviously, the higher your attack is, the more damage you're going to do. The more damage you do, the quicker you defeat enemies. Pretty simple. If you see a shield or other type of piece of armor icon, that will be your defense. And your defense works against attack. So depending on how high an enemy's attack rating is, that will do that amount of damage against you. Now your defense will reduce the amount of damage taking for each hit. The higher your defense is, the less damage you take. So if your enemy has a very high attack, you better have a very high defense, or this battle will be over quickly. Across the bottom of this character sheet, we see a whole bunch of different icons. Now these are your elemental resistances. So looking across this sheet, I see a sun, looks like some fire, a lightning bolt, a snowflake, and a crescent moon. And these will be all types of elemental defenses that this character has. These work much like your physical defense, like your armor rating above, except this will focus more on that specific type of magic or type of damage in particular. So sure, you might have a great piece of armor on, but if you have a low fire rating, then an enemy fire spell or just fire in general will still do a good amount of damage to you. Likewise with your lightning bolt or the snowflake, which will probably indicate cold or freezing damage. Now that we have an understanding of the general stats, let's take a quick look at how these affect the individual class types. Don't worry, we'll have a separate video for each one of these classes and their different class types. Starting on the left, we have the fighters, and their subclasses will typically be a striker, support, and tank. Fighters will typically have a high strength and constitution, either a moderate or low agility, and a low intelligence and wisdom. Not to say that fighters are stupid, it's just that they spend most of their time with their sword or their guns, and their main focus is dealing straight up physical damage. Next on the list are rogues, and they will come in either a thief, assassin, or specialist type of subclass. Rogues will focus more on agility and dexterity, as during combat, they'll typically try to skulk in the shadows and strike from a hidden spot, or sneak around and strike from behind. Either way, they're focusing more on a surprise or a precision shot rather than brute force. And finally, we have mages. They'll be either a black mage, a white mage, or basically it's magic. There's really no good way to define a third type of mage, being that there's so many different types of magic, and once you get into these fantasy realms, anything is possible. It all depends on what the theme is for that particular game, on what type of abilities that they'll be able to give mages. So I'm just going to call it, shut up, it's magic. Mages will typically not have any strength or agility and pour all of their skill points into their intelligence or wisdom. And actually, your intelligence score will most likely affect how much damage you do, since everything a mage does is the manipulation of magical energy, and that requires the use of their mind. Before this video ends, we're going to cover a bunch of concepts and abbreviation that are common in gaming. Grab a seat, this might take a little while. Just to reiterate, attack versus defense. Attack is how much damage you do, defense is how much damage you can resist. Buffs versus debuffs. A buff is something that benefits you or makes your character stronger, while a debuff is the opposite and will make your character weaker. A buff might be your mage casting a spell that will increase your defense or attack. A debuff might be your black mage casting a poison spell that will continuously damage an opponent, or a spell that will actually weaken your enemy's defense. And with that lower defense, your character's normal attack will do even more damage because, once again, your attack is how much damage you do, and defense is how much damage is absorbed per attack. As you gain levels, you'll be able to gain access to different skills and abilities. The graphical arrangement of these skills can be shown in what's called a skill tree. Now, a skill tree gets its name because the skills are arranged in a tree-like formation, meaning that you need to gain or unlock certain skills before other skills, either farther down the branch or tree, can be unlocked. So it's a situation where you need to unlock skills A and B before you get down to skills F and G. Some skills can be very powerful. If a skill is particularly powerful, it may have what's called a cooldown. Now, a cooldown, when talking about skills, is the amount of time that's required for you to wait until you can cast or use that skill again. For example, if you have a skill that allows you to take a giant hammer, slam it into the ground, and everyone around you takes a massive amount of damage, you can't be allowed to keep using that skill in rapid succession, otherwise the game would be incredibly unbalanced. Therefore, that skill will either require a large amount of stamina or energy, or it will have a cooldown effect, meaning that you can only use it once every 45 seconds or so. This will help balance the game so there's still a bit of challenge in it for the player. Critical hits are awesome if you score them on an enemy, not so much if an enemy scores one on you. A critical hit is a hit that does a massive amount of damage. The frequency of a critical hit can be dependent on your luck, your agility. Sometimes some buffs might be able to give you a higher chance to do a critical hit, but for the most part, they'll happen at random, or if you're playing a first-person shooter, if there's a specific weak spot somewhere on the enemy, then every time you hit that area, you'll be able to do additional damage. Aggro is short for aggression. And the way this worked in gaming is whoever is doing a lot of damage, that person will be what's called drawing aggro. And what that means is if you in particular are doing a lot of damage on the battlefield, the enemies will take note of that and they will all start to gang up on you. You may have access to certain buffs or gear that may reduce the amount of aggro that you draw. That way you can keep dealing damage and not draw the attention of the enemies, but for the most part, as you deal more damage and as you cause more chaos on the battlefield and make your presence known, more enemies will realize your presence and they'll all focus on you, the main damage dealer. The first abbreviation is DPS, which stands for damage per second. This is a value that takes into consideration the overall attack power of your weapon and weighs it against how quickly you can attack with it. So for example, if you're using a big heavy weapon, you'll be able to do a lot of damage with each attack, but chances are you will not be able to attack rapidly with it. Conversely, if you use a small light weapon, you will be able to attack very quickly, but each individual attack will not be doing that much damage. So, DPS is a value of how quickly you can attack and how much damage you do with each attack, and it's just an average between those two values. DOT stands for damage over time. This type of damage takes effect if you are poisoned or your character is on fire and they are taking a small amount of damage, but that damage is continuous. So for example, if you get hit with a poison dart, you won't be taking all that much damage from both the dart or from the poison initially, but the poison will continue to damage you for however long the poison is still in your system. Same thing with fire damage. AoE stands for Area of Effect. This is another type of damage abbreviation. In this case, the main focal point of a spell or detonation will be one specific spot on the map or in the battlefield. However, anything within a certain area or a certain radius of that detonation will be taking damage. So for example, a grenade, a rocket launcher, blast, or a giant fireball landing in the battlefield, that will strike at one specific location. However, anything within a given radius will also be taking damage. Res is short for either revive or resurrect. We use the term res because it's only one syllable, and it's typically used in action games where even split seconds make the difference on the battlefield. So if there is a skill or an ability that makes reference to either resing or self-res or time to res another player, this is what they're talking about. It's bringing them back to life or bringing them back into the game somehow. Finally, we have NPC, which stands for non-playable character. Now, when you get into larger games, there's going to be NPCs everywhere. An NPC can be pretty much anyone that you do not fight or someone that is not within your party. So this can be shopkeepers, merchants, pretty much anyone who isn't involved in combat and has an actual name. Sure, random people on the streets as you're walking through towns and cities could be considered NPCs, but this term is typically applied within the context of someone who's actually named, has some type of importance to the overall story. And that brings us to the conclusion of the first video in the series. You should now have a basic understanding of whatever you can encounter in modern gaming. There's still a lot more to explore and discuss, but this will give you a brief overview of the general trends that are present in modern day gaming. In the next video, we'll be talking about fighters, the first of the three major art classes. So, thanks for watching. You can follow me on Twitter at Hypersyntax, follow me on YouTube at Syntax, and follow me on Twitch at Hypersyntax. See you in the next class.